You shall not make for yourself a graven image. Most people picture a distant, golden statue. The Hebrew word is pesel, carved image, from pesel to hew. Here's the twist. That same verb appears in Exodus 34:1 when God tells Moses, "Hew for yourself 2 tablets of stone." Same root. One commanded, one forbidden. So carving was never the offense. The question is what the carving represents and how the invisible God can ever be seen at all. That answer doesn't arrive until the New Testament. Exodus 24. You shall not make for yourself a pesel or any temuna, any likeness of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. Notice the second word sitting right beside pesel, temuna. Form, likeness, shape. It shows up dozens of times across the Hebrew Bible, almost always attached to the question of what something actually looks like, what shape it takes, what a person could point to and say, "There, that's it." The command places pesel, a sculptured image, beside temuna, a form or likeness, joined by an or rather than an and. Together, they broaden the prohibition well beyond one material or technique. Israel must not manufacture a worship image, carved or otherwise, patterned after anything in creation. The people receiving this command had just spent centuries surrounded by cultures where that kind of carving was the entire religious economy. Canaan, the land they were about to enter, was full of it. Archaeologists have recovered large numbers of small figurines from homes and settlements across the region, molded from clay, carved from wood, cast from bronze. Some may portray Baal, Asherah, or other local deities. Others may serve protective, fertility, or household ritual functions. And in many cases, their precise identities remain genuinely debated among archaeologists. What their domestic scale does show clearly is that religious imagery in that world wasn't confined to monumental temples guarded by priests. It was woven into ordinary household life, the way a calendar or a set of dishes might be today. To tell Israel not to carve an image of God wasn't asking them to avoid something exotic. It was asking them to walk directly against the current of everything their new neighbors considered normal, respectable, and religiously responsible. Moses spells out just how wide that prohibition reaches a few verses later in the same speech. Deuteronomy 4:16-18 lists it almost like a checklist meant to close every loophole in advance. The likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal on the earth, any winged bird that flies in the sky, anything that creeps on the ground, any fish in the water below the earth. And then, in verse 19, Moses turns the list toward the sky itself, warning Israel not to look up at the sun, the moon, and the stars and be drawn to worship and serve them, things the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under heaven. Every register of the created world, animal, human, celestial, gets named and ruled out as raw material for a shape of God. Nothing visible was permitted to substitute for the one thing Israel had actually experienced at Horeb, a voice. The golden calf introduces a second manufacturing word, and Hebrew keeps the two carefully separate rather than treating them as interchangeable. Pasal describes something carved or hewn, worked out of stone or wood. Masecha describes something cast or molten, poured liquid into a mold and cooled into shape. Leviticus 19:4 reaches for the second one. Do not turn to elilim, worthless things, and do not make for yourselves Elohei Masecha, gods of cast metal. That distinction matters later, because when Israel finally breaks this command in the most infamous way possible, the text is careful about which word it uses. Follow this command forward to the place it gets tested almost immediately. While Moses is still on the mountain receiving these very words, the people grow impatient below, and Aaron gathers their gold earrings and makes them what Exodus 32:4 calls an igel masecha, a molten calf. The same verse also mentions Aaron fashioning it bacheret, commonly translated with an engraving tool, so the exact process may have involved casting, followed by shaping or finishing work, though scholars debate the precise sequence. Whatever the process, the label the text settles on emphasizes a cast image, something visible, something manufactured, something that could be pointed to, touched, and controlled, standing in for a god who had, up to that point, only ever shown up as a voice, a fire, and a cloud. The process matters here. We'll come back later to the harder question of exactly whom Israel thought this calf represented. But the tabernacle itself appears to break this rule, and a careful reader will already be raising the objection. If carved images are forbidden this absolutely, why does God himself command carved cherubim for the Ark of the Covenant only a few chapters later, in Exodus 25:18? 2 cherubim of gold, hammered work on the 2 ends of the mercy seat. That looks, at first glance, like the very thing chapter 20 just outlawed. But look at what the cherubim were actually for. Nobody in Israel bowed to them, prayed to them, or brought sacrifices before them as objects of worship. They faced each other, wings stretched forward, framing an empty space above the mercy seat where God's presence was said to meet with Israel, a presence the text never gives a shape or a face. The cherubim didn't represent God. They pointed toward the place where God chose to be present without ever letting anyone carve him. That's the difference the whole command has been circling from the start. An image that gestures toward God's presence without claiming to contain it is doing something entirely different from an image built to stand in for him. The first artist named as Spirit-filled in Scripture worked on those very images. Exodus 31, 1-5 names a craftsman called Bezalel, filled, the text says, with the Spirit of God, with skill, intelligence, and knowledge in every craft, appointed to oversee and perform the tabernacle's artistic work. Under that Spirit-enabled craftsmanship, the cherubim were fashioned not by carving, but by hammering, beaten out of gold, according to God's own specifications. The same hands that could have carved an idol were instead commissioned, directed, and Spirit-filled for a project God himself designed down to the measurements. The skill wasn't the problem. A trained hand with a hammer or a chisel was never inherently dangerous. What made the golden calf a violation and the cherubim an act of worship was never the tools. It was what was being made, and whether the shape being formed was one God had actually authorized or one a frightened crowd invented on their own timetable. Place Israel's sanctuary beside a Mesopotamian temple, and the difference becomes architectural. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, and later Babylon, the innermost chamber of a major temple almost always held a cult statue, a carved or cast image of the god, which priests would ritually wash, clothe, feed, and carry in procession, treating the object as something close to a living resident of the building. Walk into Israel's Holy of Holies, past the veil, and you find no such statue. The room wasn't physically empty. It held the ark, containing the covenant tablets, with the jar of manna and Aaron's staff preserved in association with it, and the cherubim above it. But at the center, in the place a pagan temple would have installed its god, there was no image of Yahweh at all, just an empty space above the mercy seat where the text insists God's presence met with Israel without ever consenting to be looked at. The surrounding temple cultures commonly built houses for their gods and installed visible cult statues within them. Israel built a house for its God and left the throne itself iconless, on purpose. That contrast, voice against form, is where the Second Commandment reveals what it was actually protecting. Moses makes the argument directly when he repeats the commandments to the next generation in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Take careful heed to yourselves, he says, for you saw no form, temuna, on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Deuteronomy 4:15. You heard a voice, you saw fire, smoke, a mountain trembling. You did not see a shape. And Moses draws the conclusion directly from that absence. Because you saw no form, do not corrupt yourselves by making a pesel for yourselves, in the form of any figure. The command isn't only about avoiding false gods. It's about refusing to give the true God a shape he never gave himself. A voice can command you. A voice can't be owned. The moment you carve a form, you've quietly reversed that relationship, because now the shape sits in your house, under your roof, waiting for you to decide when to approach it instead of the other way around. This is why the prophets, when they finally take direct aim at idols, almost never bother arguing about which god is more powerful. They go for something simpler and, honestly, more devastating. Isaiah 44 spends nearly 20 verses walking through the process step by step. A man cuts down a tree. He uses half of it for firewood, warms himself, bakes bread over the coals, and with the other half, Isaiah says, he makes a god. He carves a pesel and bows down to it and prays to it, saying, "Deliver me, for you are my God." Isaiah isn't building a philosophical case against idolatry. He's just describing what actually happened in that workshop, plainly, and letting the absurdity do the work itself. The same log, firewood in one hand, deity in the other, decided entirely by which half of the tree a craftsman happened to reach for. Psalm 115 takes the same argument and turns it into something almost rhythmic, a kind of relentless inventory. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see, ears, but do not hear, hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk. Verse after verse, the psalm lists a body part and immediately cancels it. A mouth that cannot speak isn't really a mouth. The psalm is arguing, almost mockingly, that a carved form doesn't actually contain the presence it's supposed to represent. It just borrows the shape of a presence, the way a photograph borrows the shape of a face without being able to answer when you speak to it. Hebrew reaches for the same contempt with a third word, elilim, worthless things. Its precise origin debated, but its mocking tone unmistakable, possibly a deliberate play on el, the ordinary word for God, as though elilim means something closer to little gods or no gods. And Habakkuk asks the same question in a sharper key. What profit is a pesel that its maker should carve it, a teacher of lies? Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, "Awake," to a silent stone, "Arise." The craftsman speaks to the object he built with his own hands, begging it to come alive, when the entire transaction only ever moved in one direction. He shaped it. It never shaped him back. Isaiah returns to this same craftsman's workshop one more time in chapter 46 and adds a detail that lands harder than almost anything else in this whole study. Because it isn't really about craftsmanship at all anymore. It's about weight and who's carrying whom. Bel bows down, Nebo stoops, he says, naming two of Babylon's chief gods directly. Their idols are on beasts and livestock. The things you carry are loaded as burdens on weary animals. In Isaiah's vision of Babylon's humiliation, its gods have to be loaded onto animals and hauled away as cargo, unable to move themselves an inch, likely a picture of defeat and captivity. And then Isaiah turns the entire image upside down. "Listen to me, house of Jacob," he writes. "I have made, and I will carry. I will bear, and I will save." Their gods have to be carried. Israel's God carries them. That single contrast, who has to be lifted and who does the lifting, says almost everything the Second Commandment was trying to protect from the very beginning. Return to the golden calf scene for a moment, because it shows exactly how quickly this temptation moves once it's given an opening. Israel doesn't clearly renounce the God who brought them out of Egypt. Exodus 32:4 records Aaron announcing, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And 32:5 has him building an altar and proclaiming a feast to the Lord, using God's own covenant name over an object made of melted jewelry. The narrative strongly suggests Aaron was trying to connect the calf with Yahweh himself, not simply swap him out for a different deity with a different name. Whether the image was intended as Yahweh, a pedestal for his presence, or a visible symbol of his power remains debated among scholars. And the plural language, "these are your gods," complicates any tidy answer. What's clear either way is that Israel attached God's saving identity to a manufactured, visible object, on their own schedule, in a shape they controlled. Jeremiah picks up this same thread and pushes it further into the emotional register of betrayal rather than mere foolishness, treating this pattern as more than an ancient mistake locked inside the wilderness narrative. Jeremiah 10:14 says, "Every craftsman is put to shame by his idols, for his images are false, and there is no breath in them." No ruach, no breath or spirit. Genesis reaches for a related but different word when God breathes life into Adam in Genesis 2:7, neshama, the breath of life. The two words aren't identical, but the contrast Jeremiah is drawing still holds. Whatever word you use for it, breath is the one thing that separates a living being from a shaped object, and it's precisely what a pesel can never receive, no matter how skilled the carving. You can give something a face, you cannot give it breath. This same temptation follows Israel into exile, where it finally meets its most literal test. Daniel 3 describes Nebuchadnezzar erecting a golden selim, the Aramaic word for image, 90 feet tall on the plain of Dura, and ordering the entire empire to bow whenever the music played. The location changes, the language shifts from Hebrew to Aramaic, but the underlying demand is identical to what Aaron built at the base of Sinai centuries earlier. A visible, towering, manufactured object asking for the loyalty that belongs to a God who has never once agreed to hold still long enough to be measured for a statue. Paul carries this same argument straight into the Greco-Roman world, where carved images had reached a level of craftsmanship Israel's wilderness generation never could have imagined. Standing in Athens, surrounded by some of the finest sculpture in the ancient world, he tells the philosophers gathered at the Areopagus in Acts 17:29 that since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. And in Romans 1:23, describing humanity's slow drift away from what it once knew of God, Paul writes that people exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Exchanged, not merely misunderstood. A trade was made, something living handed over for something carved, and Paul treats that exchange as the root move behind almost every other distortion that follows it. This is where the whole trajectory of the command turns and points somewhere unexpected, because the New Testament doesn't simply repeat the prohibition. It answers the question the prohibition leaves hanging in the air. If God refuses to be captured in a shape carved by human hands, how does anyone ever get an accurate picture of what he's actually like? John 1:18 gives the answer directly. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. Not carved him, made him known, exegeted him, the way you'd explain something rather than sculpt it. Paul reaches for a different but related word when he describes Jesus in Colossians 1:15. He is the image, icon in the Greek, of the invisible God. For Christian readers, icon inevitably resonates with the Bible's long concern about images, whether or not Paul is directly invoking Exodus 20. The difference isn't the word image, it's the direction the image travels. A pesel is something a person shapes downward, forcing raw material into a form they've decided God should have. Jesus, as Colossians describes him, is the image moving the opposite direction entirely, God expressing himself outward into a form he chose, rather than a form imposed on him by someone else's chisel. Hebrews 1:3 pushes the same idea even further, calling Jesus the exact imprint of God's nature, language borrowed from a seal pressed into wax, where the image in the wax isn't a guess at the seal's shape, it's a precise, direct transfer of it. Paul makes the contrast explicit again in 2 Corinthians 4:4, describing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Across all four of these passages, the vocabulary keeps circling back to the same resolution. From a Christian reading of the canon, the prohibition against manufactured images finds an unexpected counterpart in the New Testament. God makes himself known decisively in the Son, whom Paul calls the image of the invisible God, not manufactured by a human hand, but coming from the very nature he represents, which is exactly what made every wooden and metal substitute a counterfeit rather than an alternative. So what does "you shall not make for yourself a pesel" actually ask of a life that has never carved a statue or bowed to a household god? It asks something quieter and, honestly, harder to catch in the moment. Ezekiel saw this coming long before anyone stopped literally carving wood. Ezekiel 14:3, God tells the prophet that certain elders sitting right in front of him have taken their idols into their hearts. No workshop, no chisel, just a heart quietly arranging its own private version of God, shaped to fit whatever that person had already decided they wanted him to be. It asks whether you've been carving God into a shape more comfortable than the one he's actually described himself as having. The Protestant reformer John Calvin, writing centuries later, described the human heart as something like a perpetual factory of idols. And whatever you think of the rest of his theology, the observation lands. Nobody today is likely to melt down jewelry into a calf standing in a field with a hammer and a mold. But it's entirely possible to quietly sand God down into a shape that only ever affirms you, that never asks anything costly, that shows up exactly when you want comfort and stays conveniently silent about everything else. That isn't literally a pesel. No carving is involved, but it repeats the same underlying impulse by analogy, reshaping God into something more manageable than his own revelation. It shows up in the version of God some people carry that only ever agrees with them, that never once says the word repent, that exists mainly to bless the plans a person had already made before praying about them. It shows up in reducing an infinite, speaking God down into a set of manageable principles, a formula for prosperity, a vending machine that dispenses outcomes if the right rituals are performed in the right order. It can show up in something as ordinary as a favorite verse, quoted so often and so selectively that it quietly becomes the whole picture, editing out every harder passage that doesn't fit as comfortably. It can even show up in certainty itself, in the confidence that a theological system has finally finished capturing God completely, with nothing left that might still surprise or unsettle. None of that looks like bowing to a statue in a temple courtyard, but it's the same underlying move Aaron made with the earrings, taking a God who had only ever revealed himself as a voice and quietly giving him a shape that's easier to control. This isn't a call to suspicion toward every mental picture or metaphor a person uses to think about God, the kind of exhausting vigilance that turns ordinary faith into constant self-audit. Scripture itself is full of pictures: shepherd, rock, fortress, father, and none of those images functions like a pesel because none of them claims to be the complete, final, controllable form of who God is. They're windows offered by God himself, not walls built by human hands to contain him. The difference the Second Commandment cares about isn't whether a person ever uses an image, it's who's doing the shaping, and whether the shape is allowed to keep changing every time the voice says something a carved God never could. Now step back and see the 6 stages this word has traced. The first tablets at Sinai are described as God's own work. After Moses shatters them, God commands him to hew the replacements himself, supplying the covenant words while Moses supplies the labor of the stone. Israel, only weeks later, fashions a molten calf from donated gold, trying to force a visible shape onto the same God who had explicitly refused one. Isaiah watches a craftsman warm his hands by a fire built from the same log he'll bow down to an hour later. Jeremiah names the one thing no chisel can ever produce: breath. Paul stands among the finest sculpture the ancient world ever produced and tells Athens that the divine cannot be formed from gold, silver, or stone by the art and imagination of man. And Jesus arrives as the answer none of those workshops could reach on their own, the image of the invisible God, not manufactured by a human hand, but sharing the very nature he makes known. If you've spent years hearing the Second Commandment as a rule that mainly applied to Bronze Age idol worship, something safely behind you, pesel says otherwise. It was never only a warning about statues. It was a warning about the constant, quiet human temptation to take a God who reveals himself through a voice, through Scripture, through the person of Jesus, and shrink him down into something smaller, safer, and easier to manage than the God who actually is. The command still stands, not because wood and stone are dangerous, but because the human hand never stops reaching for a chisel. There's a strange kind of relief buried in that warning, if you sit with it long enough. A God who refuses to be carved is also a God who refuses to be finished. Every shape a person tries to force onto him eventually cracks under the weight of who he actually turns out to be, which means the discomfort of not being able to pin him down is the same thing that keeps him from ever becoming small enough to stop matching reality. The command was never trying to keep God distant. It was trying to keep him God. If this study changed how you hear the Second Commandment, subscribe so the next one finds you, and leave even a single word in the comments below. It helps more people find these studies than you'd think. Share it with someone who's been quietly shaping God into a more comfortable size without ever realizing that's what they were doing. God bless you, and may the voice that spoke at Sinai keep unsettling every shape we're tempted to give it.